Nearly all Americans are familiar with George Armstrong Custer's name and, if nothing else, his death and loss at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Long before that deadly day, however, Custer had a varied career that included time spent on the western frontier and throughout the Civil War. Who was George Armstrong Custer in real life?
What was the true reason behind his fame? What impression did his enemies and peers have of him? During his career, did he actually achieve anything of military significance?
George Armstrong Custer was born on December 5, 1839, in New Bromley, Ohio, into a big, extended family. He moved to Michigan to live with an older half-sister and her husband when he was quite small. Custer was employed as a young teacher for almost a year after performing well in a variety of schools. After turning 18, he managed to secure a recommendation to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point despite coming from a middle-class family with no political ties and a reputation as a rabble-rouser. Even though Custer was exceptionally bright and talented in a variety of subjects, including history, geography, Latin, Greek, and horsemanship, he was a disciplinary issue upon matriculating in 1857, receiving numerous demerits and restrictions, and was essentially a lazy student. Custer nearly set a West Point record by amassing 726 demerits in just 4 years, and his poor academic performance caused him to graduate last in his class. The term GOAT is often used to describe the student who graduated last. His future Army career would have been restricted due to his lack of academic achievement, but since officers were desperately needed during the Civil War, he was assigned to Washington, D.C., after receiving his second lieutenant rank. The U.S. Army was in dire need of officers to fight in the just-started Civil War, despite his lackluster academic record. After receiving his second lieutenant commission, he was in the right place to establish relationships. In July 1861, Custer was baptized by fire during the First Battle of Bull Run. Despite being widely seen as dangerous, his acts and methods impressed Union General George McClellan, who appointed him to his staff. After that, Custer gained some notoriety during the Peninsula Campaign, which started in the spring of 1862, and gained a reputation for leadership that was both bold and daring. Many of his superiors and peers would not take the same risks as Custer. He was more of an instant reactionist than a cunning cavalry commander. While his troops died and were injured all around him during his combat experience, he hardly ever suffered anything like a serious injury. He seized the chance when he spotted it. It was dubbed Custer's luck. Custer gained notoriety as a narcissistic media hound as well, never passing up the chance to be interviewed or have his photo taken by journalists covering the conflict. Custer's name and achievements sold newspapers, so much so that Harper's Weekly sent a permanent reporter to follow him throughout the war. Regardless of whether he was directly involved in an incident or not, Custer was actually the one officer they typically turned to for a narrative. The upper Union leadership, however, liked Custer because of his good fortune. To the dismay of many of his soldiers, he led by example in combat, never shirking or avoiding direct contact, even against superior numbers. When Custer returned home on leave in December 1862, he married Elizabeth Bacon, a childhood friend. Despite the fact that her family was not particularly impressed with the young, unproven, and fairly brazen lieutenant. Known as Libby, she came from a wealthy and well-known business family, which is why Custer thought about starting his own company after the war because money was a top priority. The flamboyant Custer, the greatest of all time in the West Point class of 1861, was elevated to brigadier general at the age of 23, ahead of more senior officers, and took command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade in the summer of 1863 after General Philip Sheridan suggested to General Ulysses S. Grant that Custer be given command of a regiment or even a brigade. He soon started wearing a distinctive and colorful uniform, which increased his notoriety even further. Despite his haughty and flamboyant demeanor, Custer demonstrated effectiveness at the Battle of Gettysburg, where his cavalry screen identified and stopped General Yep Stuart from attacking Union troops on their flank. 200 Confederate soldiers who were fleeing south after their defeat were captured by Custer. Custer's brigade suffered the worst fatality rate of any Union cavalry regiment, losing about 300 men, making his success and involvement in the Union victory costly. He led his men into danger rather than ordering soldiers to their potential deaths, which may have been the sole reason he was never stripped of command. Custer would remain successful throughout the war, but his attrition rate, which averaged between 25 and 40%, would always be the highest in the Union Army. In Washington, this was not ignored. Custer had multiple affairs and was notorious for being a gambler and womanizer, even if his career success was erratic. It was also said that he had slept with other officers' spouses, specifically focusing on the widows of the men he ordered to execute. They never had children, and Libby frequently visited Custer's station, which was fairly unusual at the time. Both were prolific and industrious letter writers when they were apart, and many of their letters are still in existence now. Custer was with Major General Philip Sheridan during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign in 1864, where he was featured on Harper's Weekly's cover following a string of skirmishes. Sheridan still regarded Custer as a very dependable cavalry leader. Following their move, Custer's cavalry unit took part in the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse in Petersburg, Virginia. Custer was elevated to both Major General, albeit a brevet or temporary title, and national hero status for leading one of the war's final daring cavalry raids. Custer, along with his wife Libby, was present at Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender together with Grant and Sheridan. As a present, Sheridan gave Libby Custer the table where Grant and Lee signed the official surrender papers. Custer's name and deeds were featured in practically every major national newspaper after the war ended. Although his victories on the battlefield were occasionally overstated, they always emphasized the fact that Custer was never gravely injured, leading some to assert that God had anointed and protected him. Custer's luck was like that. Custer debated quitting the army to start his own business after the war, but he was persuaded to serve in the Southwest, where conflicts with Native American tribes arose. He was offered leadership of the newly formed 7th Cavalry Regiment as a sweetener. After he and Libby arrived in Kansas in September 1866, Custer, who had lost his temporary flag rank and was now officially a lieutenant colonel, met his troops. All of the men were fully aware of his wartime exploits and his casualty record. In the spring of 1867, Custer joined the military offensive against the Sioux and Cheyenne right away, as was common. Platoons and occasionally even company-sized units of his regiment would conduct scouting expeditions to determine the location and temperament of the Indians as well as the state of the settlers. Custer occasionally participated in these patrols and occasionally did not, but when some of the men were slain in combat, the bulk of the survivors held Custer responsible, thinking that he also occasionally stepped down from his leadership, and it was during one of these absences that the troops were slain. Custer was raised on accusations of desertion and abandonment. In reality, he had been spending time with his spouse. He and Libby were reinstated after the ensuing court-martial found him guilty and sentenced him to a year without pay and loss of command. In November 1868, Custer returned to duty and set out to establish himself in this new theater of operations. He attacked a Cheyenne camp along the Washita River in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. Sheridan formally requested that Custer be sent back on duty as quickly as possible, given the responsibility of calming the unruly natives. The conflict. Although Custer's claims that his soldiers had killed a significant number of warriors were unverifiable, the operation was the Army's first significant victory in the area and temporarily brought peace to the area. Although the event received a lot of media attention and Custer quickly returned to the public view, the Cheyenne named Yellow Hair attracted attention from those outside of the United States as well. Then something went wrong that needed to be fixed. A tiny gold deposit was located by prospectors in 1864, but in November 1865, a considerably larger gold deposit was discovered in South Dakota's Deadwood Gulch, and by 1876, hundreds of prospectors had flocked to the new town of Deadwood. The issue was that this region was still Sioux territory and was protected from encroachment by the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was signed in 1868 and included the territory of Wyoming. In 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant issued an order requiring all Sioux to leave the Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming by January 1876 due to political pressure and the prospect of a difficult re-election. The War Department interpreted this as noncompliance and used it as justification for military intervention, as the government knew the Sioux would not be able to leave the territory during the infamously harsh winter. Since Sitting Bull, Ahuk Pampa, Dakota Chief, and the respected Holy Man were the main Sioux leaders opposing the invasion, the U.S. government now faced a serious issue. Tensions in Washington were rising as a result of Custer giving the Army security to gold miners who invaded cemeteries. Custer was sent back to Washington for a formal hearing after the miners' invasion of the area caused a few minor conflicts. Custer was charged with violating the Treaty of Laramie by permitting the miners to enter the territory, but in his defense during his testimony before the congressional hearing, he avoided taking the blame, refused to be the scapegoat, and openly implicated a number of Grant administration officials. The Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, which gave both the Cheyenne and the Arapaho lands, was signed by the U.S. government. Because they believed the areas were unworthy and constrictive, the tribes never settled there and were unable to follow the buffalo herds. Custer accused Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, Secretary of the Interior Zachariah Chandler, Attorney General Edwards Pierpont, Secretary of the Treasury Benjamin H. Bristow from 1874 to 1876, his successor Lot M. Morrill, Secretary of War James D. Cameron, and his predecessors William W. Belknap and Alphonso Taft of advancing U.S. expansion and expulsion of the Sioux in violation of the treaty. Custer had recently exposed the individuals who were determined to seize the area at all costs, and he gained a lot of enemies in the process. Additionally, he revealed the corruption that was the result of the resignation of Belknap on May 2 and the president's brother, Orville Grant, in order to exploit the settlers and the military. Belknap and Orville Grant established monopolies at frontier stations, driving away competitors and setting exorbitant prices. Belknap and Grant were both involved in the problem of Indian Bureau agents stealing the food and supplies that were given to the Native Americans and reselling them at a higher price. After disclosing the hearing's specifics and the expansion's facts in breach of treaties, Custer also became a pariah. Custer demonstrated their accountability. When Custer attempted to leave Washington and return to his men, President Grant reportedly became enraged and had him imprisoned. He also dismissed Custer from his command. It required the work of multiple senior generals, including James Crook, Winfield Scott Hancock, Philip Sheridan, and William T. Sherman. Since they were aware of the truth, these generals and many others spoke up for Custer because they felt sorry for him. It would have been a political catastrophe for Grant if he hadn't finally given in to pressure and let Custer take back command of the 7th Cavalry. In May, the U.S. expulsion effort got underway. It led previous adversaries, including the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, to unite as close allies for their shared survival. Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota Sioux, Crazy Horse of the Cheyenne, Dull Knife of the Northern Cheyenne, and others were present at the unique meeting that Chief Sitting Bull had called. Between 6,000 and 10,000 Indians, depending on the source, congregated along the Little Bighorn River in Montana when the Grant administration started a fight with the most well-known warriors of the time, numbering between 2,000 and 4,000 warriors and their families. Only 5 Arapaho officials showed up on June 25, Left Hand, who was accepted by the tribe despite being half Blackfoot and half Cheyenne Yellow. Custer's scouts found the sizable camp after several exhausting days of exploration. As stated by Left Hand in an interview with Colonel Tim McCoy in 1900, Tumone, chief of the Cheyenne, went to the Sioux chiefs and told them that we were Arapahoes and that they must return our guns and set us free. They did, but they closely watched us so we could not escape. The Arapaho were not interested in this, and when the 5 arrived at the camp, they were disarmed and threatened with execution because the Sioux did not trust them. After selecting the element of surprise, Custer decided to launch an attack, splitting his command of 210 men into 3 components to attack the Custer and his men perished, and there was conjecture that his executive officer and chief of the support group, Major Marcus Reno, was among the officers who harbored resentment toward Custer and held him accountable for the slaughter of 7th Cavalry soldiers in 1867. Captain Frederick Benteen, who was tasked with stopping the Sioux from retreated, banded together and refused to back Custer. Conspiracy theorists claim they let these men perish. 2 days later, the bodies of Custer and his men, among them his brother, Captain Thomas Custer, a 2-time Civil War Medal of Honor recipient, were found. The Sioux women had stripped the 36-year-old George Custer and the others of their clothing, but they had not scalped them. He had been shot once in the head and once in the chest. According to his and opposing Indian tales, the combat lasted about 2 hours, during which the soldiers were unable to use strong and lethal repeating rifles against the Indians. The only survivor was a Comanche scout. The nation was startled to learn of the setback, which sparked widespread racial prejudice against all Indian nations, not just the participating tribes. Indeed, it sparked another 20 years of instability by serving as the impetus for an even more forceful drive by the U.S. government farther into the Western territories. In her latter years, Libby Custer wrote a number of best-selling books on their relationship, Custer's career, and upholding his reputation and legacy. This increased her riches even further until her death in 1933. Regardless of how you feel about him, George Armstrong Custer was a courageous individual who took amazing chances. Even in death, the man known to the Indians as Yellow Hair kept his own hair. We appreciate your interest in today's Forgotten History episode. If you like this episode, please think about joining our Patreon page or becoming a channel member. This would assist us in offsetting the steadily rising production costs. As always, we appreciate your likes, shares, and comments. If you have any show ideas, please get in touch with us, and we will respond as soon as we can. Till the next time.